talk about workflows and data curation. I would like to say that I will solve these problems for you, but what I will talk to you about is my experience with these subjects in a couple of projects and using a variety of software. I put up a couple of examples here. I don't know if they're encouraging analogies or not, but we'll see. Oh, and I should have introduced myself. So I've been at Argonne for many years, working on a variety of projects, and most recently working with teams running on Argonne's Mira for a couple of different sciences, mostly in the physics realm, but in a couple of different sub areas, and looking at helping them manage their simulations and analyses. So I'm to talk about workflows and data curation, as I said. Workflows essentially refers to running multiple simulations and analysis jobs on one or more systems. And data curation is about how you manage the data produced by those jobs during the simulation and after the simulation. That's the way I'll talk about it. So why should you care about workflows? Looking at the program for ATPESC and knowing something about your backgrounds, you're going to learn a lot about optimizing your applications to run on large-scale systems, exascale systems, today's petascale systems. We have different architectures, different programming models. You have to master communication and visualization, and you'll study profiling and optimizing for node-level performance. And when you're done with that, and you've achieved some great performance with your code and scalability, what comes next is a question sort of what I'm looking to address. And again, I want to be encouraging, right? If you're not careful, you could end up with something like this mess. So I'll use this traffic analogy. We don't want that to happen to you. And I would contend that the reason things like this happen is because we can't program those things, right? We can program our jobs, so we can do better. So if we look at an autonomous workflow of cars where they're communicating with each other, that's more like what we're looking at. Or maybe it's more like what we hope to be looking at. So there's research being done at Texas that is looking at how we could manage the flow of traffic if we had communication between all of the vehicles on the road. And this is really amusing to me, right? So if we understand the flow, there's no more red lights. And we just manage it, and we know where all the cars are going, and we can control when they go. We avoid collisions. We have continuous flow. OK. It's a little idealized. It's a simulation, right? Things don't always work out exactly the way that you intend them in your simulation, but we hope so, right? We have to aim for this. And also something about data curation. How should you manage your data during the simulation and afterward? Again, sort of the pessimistic conclusion on the top. If you're not paying attention, you might end up with things all over the floor and difficult to find. And if you're really careful, then you'll always be able to find your data. Statistically, we're all probably somewhere in the middle, right? If we look at an example of allocations that occur on these systems, I've encountered people who had fairly large simulations, but they only intended to run a small number of jobs or smallish number of jobs. And in that case, it's probably manageable for them to control it by themselves, do all the work manually. So if you had a series of well laid out simulations that used a significant fraction of Mira, for example, in this case, in this example, 16,000 nodes, and your campaign called for running, say, 40 jobs for 12 hours each. We see this all the time. Maybe you could manage that yourself, and your simulation would produce from, say, the 40 jobs, 40 directories full of simulation output, and you can do OK with that. You still probably would benefit from automating it to some extent, but it would be okay. That's not the typical case. So in the more typical cases, we have much larger allocations, and people run many more simulations. I've seen projects run thousands of simulations over the course of a year. And they have associated analysis jobs that they have to run. They might have allocations across multiple facilities. They might do simulations at both facilities, analyses at both facilities. They have to think about data transfer. They have to think about publishing that data to their communities in some cases, and how they'll deal with archival storage, because while the simulations run in the course of 1 year, they may not be done analyzing the data in that year. So I would say in this case, workflows could possibly save you. However, you might have to code them yourself. So why do you care? Why would you want to use workflows? So in this case, instead of you submitting each job to the scheduler yourself, you could lay out the campaign of jobs to be run, have them automatically submitted, have some record of the submission and the execution and the data produced, and it would be easier for you, hopefully, like managing traffic. You could increase concurrency if you could disentangle data dependencies. Some of your jobs may be very serial or independent. Some of them may rely closely on the data produced by the job before them. In the most trivial case, you would just stage these sequentially, but if you understand the data dependencies, then some of them at least could run concurrently in the scheduler to the limits of the machine or the policy on the machine. Whether you code them yourself or you use some software for managing workflows, you might get some additional robustness. There's a possibility of co-scheduling multiple resources so that you're analyzing data that's produced by a simulation while the simulation continues. It gives you some systematization of data management, you have a record of what was produced and where it went. And I was already touching on this to some extent, but you can look at provenance and metadata tracking for understanding all the details of the jobs that you ran. Usually when people think of this, for a lot of people, I would say provenance is not a term that's in their vocabulary already. And if they think about the details of their jobs and how they ran them, they think about what parameters did they give their application and which application did they run. But there are certainly many other factors, such as which compiler was used, which compiler switches were used, what machine was it run on, what was the configuration of the machine when it ran, hopefully not what time of day it was, but these factors come into play. And those things go ultimately toward reproducibility of results, which we really should be working on improving. I made a reference there that the talk that follows mine is from Kirsten Cleese Van Dam, who will talk about provenance, so you will learn about that shortly. So what is a workflow? It really depends who you ask, and it will vary for all of you. It's basically a collection of jobs to be run, and there's a lot of variation. So the means of describing and running workflows can be script jobs, or you may have independent jobs and dependencies between them. You may have jobs that run all within a block, but on different sizes of sub-blocks. You may do in situ workflows. You may write them yourself to do something that's specific to your work. And you may use some software. So I'll try and touch on some of these things. And in many places, you'll see that I'm referring to the things that are specific to Mira or Argonne and the Cobalt scheduler. And that's because that's the perspective I have. That's what I know the best. So as long as you're aware of that, then you'll know that you may have to make some adjustment if you're thinking about these things in terms of some other system. So if a very simple job submission will just specify the number of nodes and the duration and the project and the application to run. If you, instead of submitting your executable, you can submit a script and that script will run multiple instances of your application. So in this case, you look at the figure on the right, you would be submitting a longer job, and it would be running your application multiple times within it. This might be helpful to you. It also might not be helpful to you because depending on the size of your job, extending the duration will not necessarily help you get through the scheduler faster. It may work in the opposite direction. It may be easier for you to manage, but it may extend your queue wait time, for example. If we look at job dependencies, so you can run multiple jobs and have them associated with one another and control their flow sequentially through the scheduler, but have them each retain that shorter queue time, a shorter run time, and therefore hopefully get through the queue faster. You can set job dependencies, again using the Cobalt scheduler, with the command line option that I specified here, the -- dependencies. So in this case, you would submit the first job, you submit the second job with a dependency on the first one, and the third one with a dependency on the first two, and the third job will not run until the other two have finished and exited successfully. There is an advantage to doing this because dependent jobs will accumulate score more quickly and therefore get through the queue more quickly. However, now you're submitting multiple independent short jobs. You will bump into this limit of currently, on Mira, for example, the policy is that you can have 20 jobs in the queue at one time. So once you bump into this limit, what happens to you? You sit and wait, right, until your number of jobs in the queue falls below 20, and then you submit another 1 or 3. And this puts you in a loop of interacting with the scheduler. It'd be great if that could just happen while you were sleeping. Well, maybe it can. But we'll talk about another example here. I'm actually going to jump ahead one. So there's also the concept of ensemble jobs where you can submit one larger job. If you have small jobs to run, you can submit one larger job, and within that job, run multiple smaller jobs. So what you see in the status, we call it the grunculator at Argonne. It's a status page that shows the jobs running on individual mid-planes or half racks of Mira. And so the 8 green blocks that you see on the left, there's a reason why I have this multiple of 2 in my head. Those are a 4K block, so it's a 4K job. And within that, you could run a variety of smaller jobs. So you see on in the box on the top left that we're running, say, 1K and a 512 and a 2K job. So it's 4K, but it's multiple smaller jobs. Again, why would you want to do this? And I'll go back to the previous slide. Because ensemble jobs are larger than the individual smaller jobs, and larger jobs accumulate score more quickly, at least in the Cobalt scheduler with the policy that we have in place. How do you do this? So here's an example with a pointer to the Cobalt track so that this one can be updated. But the basic idea is that within your job script, you query which blocks are available of a given size, and then it's up to you to manually boot those blocks. This happens automatically for you in other cases. But in this case, you have to manually boot all of those blocks. And then you can run your job in each of those blocks. That's the second code block that you see there. And then when it's finished, you have to free the blocks. But this allows you to achieve running multiple smaller jobs within one larger one. If we look at how we can run across ALCF systems, so we have Mira, we have Cooley, the analysis cluster. How can you set job dependencies between these systems? Well, we don't currently support that. So what you can do is if you script it, you can script it so that you're watching your job run on Mira, for example, and when it finishes, you can automate the submission of a job to Cooley. And there's also a mechanism for going back the other way, but basically you have to stitch this together yourself through scripting. It's a convenience in this case that Mira and Cooley, and I also have Cetus, a testing and debugging system, included here that they all share the same file systems. So that at least you don't have to move data around to analyze the data that was produced by your simulation on Mira. There's a number of software packages for managing workflows. The 3 packages I've listed here are Swift and Pegasus, which relies on Condor, and Fireworks. I'm most familiar with Swift, so I'll talk to you about Swift. There are certainly other packages that you could use for this too. So in the case of Swift, Swift is essentially, it consists of 2 parts. One is a C-like language for expressing your workflow, and the second one is an execution engine that can take that workflow and then submit the related jobs on the compute resources that you've configured it to run on. So there's this driving example for Swift where if you had, say, you wanted to study the relationship between some set of proteins that you're interested in and some potential drug candidates, and you had, say, 10 proteins and 100,000 drug candidates, this obviously translates to many, many individual jobs. And how would you manage this? So this is sort of the pathological case for managing jobs across such a system. The way that you would describe this in Swift is, in this case, with this nested loop over proteins and ligands, and the inner block of the loop is simple, but we have to disentangle it a little bit. So the for each loops are saying for each protein and its index, and for each ligand and its index, we'll call this doc routine. Okay, so the doc is taking the proteins and the ligands and some additional data for the job, and the results are stored in an associated doubly indexed structure array and a log array. So each job that's run is returning these, right? And in these cases, what doc is actually doing is it's a wrapping of a command line execution that will be submitted on a resource that you choose later. So you can design your workflow independent of the resources that you'll run on, and the results will be returned. Those results are probably file references, and so then you build up this collection of files that's produced by this collection of jobs, and then later you can analyze them as you see this whole structure block is passed into the analyze routine. The actual implementation of doc is omitted here, but I assure you it's really just a very simple wrapping of a command line. And the way that you run this is just with, on the command line, Swift, and thanks to configuration that the Swift team has done to support well-known resources, you can just specify resource names, and it knows about the available resources that are there, and you tell it to run doc.swift. In this case, this is essentially the Swift script that you see above. How can it be this simple, you might say? Well, there are parameters governing the configuration in this definition of Cooley and Blues in this case that control things like what are the resources I'm submitting to, what is the scheduler, how do I submit jobs, how do I move data in and out, what are sort of the throttles that should be applied on job submissions so I don't submit too many jobs and exceed the policy of the machine. But in this case, you could be running, depending on how many proteins and ligands you have, you could be running many, many jobs. And you have this all happening via one controller that's submitting jobs for you while you sleep, which wouldn't we all like to have that happening for us? So here are just some examples of applications that have been that have applied Swift. I won't run through them individually, but you see that they span a lot of different domains. And the key point is at the bottom in red that all of them have published science results that they obtained using Swift to manage their workflows. So Swift has been around for many years and is well supported and widely used. So I'll talk about a couple of examples. They are the HEK code, which is for cosmological simulations, and high-energy physics event generation. These are two projects that I'm involved with, and so I will describe them to you. HEK is interesting because it's an n-body code for simulating the evolution of structure in the universe. It has shown up in many places. It runs on, say, Mira, and it runs on Titan, and has run on a series of systems before that, achieving very good performance on all of them because it's designed to do so. So from the beginning, HEK was laid out such that the computationally intensive portions were abstracted out, and they could be optimized for whichever target machine they were to run on. And so on Titan, you have highly optimized routines that leverage the GPUs to good effect. And on Mira, it's very optimized to leverage the QPX instructions, vectorization on the machine, leverage all the cores. And this will remain true as we move into larger machines that have yet different architectures. The largest simulations have evolved over more than 1 trillion particles. And as you can imagine, these simulations produce huge data sets. And those data sets have to be used effectively within the project. There's also it also ties into making those results available to the community. In cosmology, there's a history of catalogs that people have generated that have then been used for later analyses, and the catalogs that are produced at the end of this workflow from all of the HEK simulations dovetail into that same thing. That history extends way back to when people generated such catalogs manually before they were even done by simulations. I find that incredible. There's much more detail about HEK and its performance in Salman Habib's talk from 2015 at ATPESC. I'd like to highlight just briefly this graphic at the top of the screen, which I stole from Salman's talk. So what we're talking about with HEK is really the left side of this graphic, where we take theory, we model that in the supercomputer, we run these huge simulations. From those, we produce galaxy catalogs that are describing the distribution of dark matter. And from those, we get some idea about the evolution of structure. We have to reconcile this with the right-hand side of the graphic, which is taking data from large-scale surveys. Here we talk about SDSS, but there are other surveys underway, larger surveys, and we'll reconcile the simulation data with the observational data to get a better understanding of the behavior of the systems. The right panel is a visualization of the structure data from a HEK simulation. If we look at the data products from HEK simulations, we tend to talk about this in terms of level 1 data, level 2 data, and level 3 data. The level 1 data is the raw particle data that's generated by the simulations. For each particle, we have 36 bytes and describing a variety of the particle's position and velocity and mass, for example. And this is obviously the largest data that's produced and not appropriate for distribution, for example, because we can't easily hand off petabytes of data. From those, we get to level 2 data, where we talk about, we subsample the raw particles to get a hopefully representative sample of them for analysis that can be done in a lighter weight fashion. From those particles, we can understand something about the clustering of them, which is describing the distribution of dark matter. So we have the particles that reside in those halos, and we have properties of the dark matter halos that are also stored. The distribution is also described by a power spectrum. In this case, we talk about matter power spectrum. There are maps made of the density distribution. There are a lot of products here that are smaller than the level 1 data, but still very significant in size. And smaller than those yet are level 3 data that are the results of analyses of the level 2 data. So here we're looking at, say, power spectrum of the halos that are identified in the clustering analyses at level 2. Merger trees, which look at how halos, galaxy clusters, behave over time through the simulation, whether they come together and they merge into one, or they cross and then they part again. And then galaxy catalogs, which feed into later analyses, which for reconciliation with, say, the observational data. We talked before about the scale of simulations in terms of typical allocations. Here are some examples of the current ongoing HEK simulations. So the outer rim simulation has run at ALCF and evolved 1 trillion particles. And you get some idea of the data produced. So in this case, we have 4 petabytes of data produced by the simulation. The Q continuum simulation was 0.5 trillion particles. And we have 2 petabytes of data from that at level 1. And the Mira and Titan universe simulations run at both facilities used 32 billion particles per simulation with 50 different simulations of that size with varying cosmological parameters. And we've generated a lot of data in this case too. The thing that's not clear from this is that while I've stated the number of particles that are used in each simulation, they are of different sizes of a portion of the universe. So while it looks like it's a straightforward decline in the number of particles, some of them are, say, over a smaller volume. So there's a different resolution of the data. Even though it's fewer particles, it's a smaller size, and actually the resolution might be higher. So a HEK workflow will look something like this. So we have the simulation that occurs, and then we have multiple levels of analysis. So I use this just to highlight the next things that I'll describe. You can see actually in the simulation case that there are small analysis boxes inside the simulation box, and this is because while the simulation runs, as it finishes a time step, there are various analyses that can happen on that simulation data on Mira or Titan. And so this is referred to as in situ analysis. Some analyses are appropriate for that, some are not. The data produced by that is obviously available to the next level of analysis and also goes out to disk and to tape with some reduction. The results of that, again, second level analysis produces data that is also stored and is available for further analysis on, say, primarily smaller analysis resources. And then there's level 3 data, which is available, like I described previously about the history of catalogs being used for analysis in the community. This is also being done with the level 3 data for the cosmology community today. I sort of grayed out the box on the right because I wanted to highlight the fact that while we have this workflow for HEK, the observational community, which needs to think about the data that it produces and how it will be reconciled with the simulation data, has obviously their own workflow that begins at, say, the survey telescopes and proceeds all the way down to the data that they'll make comparative analyses with. I described this to some extent in talking about the large HEK simulations that are underway, but I wanted to highlight the fact that leveraging multiple facilities in this way is a challenge that we don't see in all projects. but having this amount of data at multiple resources means that if you can operate, if we could operate on this data independently at each resource, then we would have just the same problem everybody has, except for maybe 2x, right? Because it's just the same problem with multiple resources or multiple instances of the problem. In this case, we have some amount of storage at each place, and we have some amount of data on disk, and we have to think about how do we preserve this data over time, how do we analyze it, and data transfer actually becomes a challenge for us. So there's an ongoing additional element of managing the HEK data that I wanted to point out. So in the first box on the workflow slide, I talked about in situ analysis. Can I get a show of hands just how many people are familiar with the term in situ analysis? Okay, good number of you. So the idea is simply that while the simulation is running, in between time steps you can run some analyses. This has several advantages, right? So the data is already in memory. For large simulations, it can take some time to read the data back off of the disk. And ideally, you could avoid that. Oftentimes, you have analysis that's performed on a different system. And so this is an opportunity to perform analysis at the same scale as the simulation. That has pluses and minuses. If you're dealing with a case where during simulation you will significantly reduce the simulation data before you write it out, this is an opportunity to analyze the data before it's reduced. It may be the only opportunity that you have to do that. In that case, if you needed to reproduce those results, those analysis results from that data, but the data's been reduced, how would you do that? The only way to do that at that point is to rerun the simulation so that you can run the analysis again on the data before it's been reduced. So if we look at how this takes place in HEK, HEK has this framework called Cosmo Tools for managing in situ analyses. And the way that it works is that the tools are essentially, they are actually bound into the executable for the simulation, and how they get executed is controlled by a configuration that's specified at the time that the simulation runs, as you would imagine. In this case, it's done according to explicit time steps that the simulation has taken, so you can specify which analyses should run at which time step. And when that happens, the simulation stops, and each rank of the simulation passes off its particle data to the analysis routine. So the interface to the in situ analysis is directly the particle data. The analysis is performed, and then the analysis exits, and the simulation proceeds to the next time step. I already said it runs prior to the data reduction. We don't need to load the data from the disk. In the case of HEK, large simulations, the data that's would be loaded for a simulation can take as much as, say, 30 minutes to load from the file system. It's already a significant number of compute hours to wait only to load the data, not even to perform the analysis. If the analysis ran long enough, then maybe that 30 minutes was justified. If the analysis is short, obviously you don't want to spend 30 minutes loading the data regularly. Also, during long runs, so HEK will run for the max queue time on these machines, and we can get some intermediate analysis results during runs, so we understand the data that's being produced. I said previously that some analyses are appropriate for this and some are not. So while the simulation code and actually the first level analysis implementations are very highly optimized, this is not true of all of the analyses that we perform, especially the ones that are in development now. And so while we may have a very highly optimized simulation code, when the analysis kicks up, if it's not as optimized as the simulation, it will add significant time to the run. Also, depending on the analysis, it might be very memory intensive, and it will already be memory constrained by the simulation data that's in memory. I said that analysis must run at a scale comparable to the simulation. This is because the simulation will have one distribution of the data, and we don't want to be redistributing the data between ranks at that time, and we want to run at the same scale. If your analysis fits that model, then we're in very good shape. If it's not, and the analysis would actually run on many fewer nodes, for example, it's not appropriate to run at this time. Obviously, we have to target the same architecture as the simulation, so we won't run GPU-based analyses for a job that's running on a non-GPU machine like the Blue Gene. And the last point that about analysis and the arrow of time, the simulations in this case proceed from some time far in the past to the present day. Some analyses may actually analyze the data in reverse. And so if that's the case, we cannot proceed through with this analysis when it proceeds in the other direction of time. So that's in situ analysis. There were some intermediate boxes on the workflow that talked about analysis of second level data. And in that case, those jobs are just like any other jobs. We will submit them. They'll run on either the same systems as the simulation or on some supporting analysis clusters. And that's a significant job in itself. And we need to look at ways of managing that campaign. So from a simulation, we could generate a collection of jobs that have to be run and then manage them flowing over the systems. And we could do that with Swift, or we could do that with some other approach. The last box was talking about running workflows on the level 3 data. And in that case, this is maybe people outside of the main HEK team looking at the Galaxy catalogs that were produced. And the way that we do that is through a tool called PDAX, which is actually based on Galaxy. If you're familiar with the Galaxy web-based framework, it gives you a way of wrapping applications so that they can be executed in the same way as Swift, right? So you have some wrapping of it that describes the command line, the parameters that will be supplied to it. And you can adjust those parameters through a web interface and submit the job. And there's a configuration on the back end that says how the job should be run, on which resource. So users can use the interface for that, which looks like this. So this is how you construct a workflow in PDAX, which again is based on Galaxy. So you have these different modules that represent jobs that will be run, and the arrows are data that's flowing between them. And this in particular is a very common workflow in HEK. So this is one that we've saved and made available to users. Users could use these individual modules and construct their own workflow. There are opportunities here for us to do interesting things in terms of understanding the jobs that the users run, which things are more important to them. We can optimize the ones that occur more often by, say, retaining the memory between the jobs. Retaining the data in memory between the jobs to accelerate the flow of all of the jobs through the queue. So some of the things that I described earlier when I was talking generally about managing jobs getting through the scheduler are, we can exploit those on the back end in this case, because as you can see, we're managing the flow of 8 different jobs over the system, and it's up to us to decide on the back end how that will happen. There's a lot of opportunities here for us to optimize that. So in terms of HEK, with respect to workflow, we have a lot of different places where that's applicable. We have simulations running at multiple sites. Clearly, multiple simulation jobs through the course of the allocation, and the data has to go to different sites. We have different analysis opportunities, either in situ or in post-processing. And for the data transfers, Globus Online has been very helpful for us. I expect you're familiar with that, but you can easily find details about that. And I talked about PDAX being a web-based analysis platform for looking at the level 3 data. Are there any questions? Yes?
In situ analysis is part of the executable, right? Because that's part of the executable that's running is also doing the analysis, right?
Yes. So the question is, were you finished?
No, so if that's my understanding is, so how do you control it by Swift? Because Swift is just like, as I understand it, just you have different executable being called as part of your job description. So now once you get into different executables, this means that the data got saved in a file. And then you have to reload it. So then how do you get the benefit of doing the analysis while the data is still in memory?
Right, okay. So the question has to do with in situ analysis and how we manage the data flowing between jobs if we're using a Swift-based workflow. Is that correct? Right, but so I have to clarify, because for in situ analysis in HEK, we are not using Swift. Okay, it's a good question, because I should have clarified in going from talking about Swift to talking about HEK and in situ analysis. You know, I was drawing this line essentially, but there's a break, right? We don't use Swift for analysis in HEK at all, let alone for in situ analysis. And there was a leading part of the question was about whether the analysis codes are bundled into the simulation code, and that is true. Yes.
What does every job in HEK represent?
Excuse me?
What does every block in HEK represent in this DAG you kind of show? Is that an independent job being submitted to the queue? In HEK?
In PDAX. This one.
Yeah.
Right, so in this case, the default way for this to happen is that the way that PDAX describes these things is that each one is its own, an execution of a particular application. And the applications are by default configured to run as individual jobs. Okay, so each one will be a job that sits in a scheduler on some machine and waits. And before and after the job runs, there is potentially a data transfer that happens. So as you have data that goes out to support the job runs, we bring the data back, we run the next job. However, in this case in particular, I said there are opportunities for us to optimize this, because we could, for example, bundle those jobs, send them both off to a single machine, have them both run within a single script job on the machine, and even possibly retain the intermediate data in memory so that we don't have to go back out to the file system, right?
So it looks like this way is going to use much more memory than if you just group them as one job where all the intermediate results will stay within the machine, within every machine.
It's possible. It's definitely possible, but I imagine there's a spectrum. Right? So in some cases, it may be applicable to bundle jobs together because they don't have high memory usage. And in other cases, you may have exactly the opposite situation. But I like it because it simplifies the burden on the user and allows us to make a lot of optimizations on the back end. So I'll talk about a second example in high energy physics. So you see on the top left, we have a picture of the ATLAS detector at the Large Hadron Collider. And you'll notice it may be difficult to see the people at the LHC and at ATLAS like to emphasize the scale of their machine by placing humans in there. So I don't know if you have the slides separately, you can see this, but they'll tend to place a human in there so that you have an idea how big this thing is, right? So it's enormous, and the data produced by it is enormous at the scale of 25 petabytes per year. And I've also placed Mira below it as a source for simulation data. So in this example, we're talking about producing data from Mira for simulation of the events like those that are produced at the LHC and are detected at the Atlas detector. These data both go off to a very large worldwide facility, the LHC computing grid, which consists of 170 computing facilities across many countries. And you can imagine that the workflow, I mean, we talk about workflow sort of in a bottom-up sense, thinking about the simulations that you're here learning about how to optimize and run on today's and tomorrow's systems, and the surrounding analyses and how you can pull this off from this bottom-up approach. That idea of workflow really occurs at multiple different levels. And so here, if we think about the flow of data from the detector or from simulations on large machines into this computing grid and into final analysis, this is a huge, long, in fact, very disconnected workflow that proceeds across these systems over time, and it takes a long time. So the Atlas experiment, in order to do their work, uses over 1 billion compute hours per year. And if you follow the development of the LHC, like many experiments, it will undergo upgrades in coming years. The data rates will increase, and so the 25 petabytes per year will increase. And there should be an associated increase in the computing that's available to the experiment to actually get their work done. Unfortunately, budgets and compute systems don't always scale at the same rate as, say, the data that's being produced. So this leaves opportunities for us. So I'll describe this to some degree in the next slides. So their workflow consists of a phase space integration, understanding the particles that would be produced, some event generation. This is Monte Carlo-based process to understand the different events that would be produced in the detector according to probabilistic models. How those resulting particles decay, their simulation as they propagate from, say, the collision site out to the detector, and then from the energy response in the detector, we try to understand, we back solve. It's an inverse problem. We try to understand exactly the decay products, right? In the simulation, we understand these things immediately because we've simulated their propagation from the collision site out to the detector. But in real life, what we get is the energy deposits in the detector, and we have to back solve to sort of understand what was produced. And then there's analysis that occurs after that. So, as I said, all of these steps propagate through the Atlas production computing system, through the LHC computing grid as individual jobs over time. And the simulation that I referred to is the particle propagation out to the detector, and that accounts for 60% of their computing load. We looked at using Mira for an earlier step, which is the event generation stage. So in this case, we had to find a way to extract the necessary inputs from the production system, and so that we could do the phase space integration and run these jobs on Mira, and then be able to return those results back to the Atlas experiment. At last year's ATPESC, Tom Lecomte talked about all of the details of this to great effect. And if you're interested, I recommend that you look at his talk from last year. So the HEP, the event generation consists of, as I said, establishing this integration grid, generating events which have some probability of occurring, and then unweighting them according to that probability. So over the entire, over all of the events, there's some probabilities, and we can reduce this. If you look at the data reductions in this case, they're at the order of 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. So we throw away a ton of data, depending on the processes being modeled. Some things happen very often, some things happen less often. The ones that happen less often, we throw away a ton of data. So the way that we did this is just an overview, and I'll go through this quickly. The way that we do this is that we have some job description that comes in, and it says what is the work to be done, what are the random seeds that we should use for the job, and it gets placed on some message queue. It gets pulled off, and the first job is the integration job, and in this case, we're pushing this to a local cluster in the HEK division at Argonne. That first stage is very serial. So we do this on a single node, and it runs for some number of hours to produce the integration grids. And when that one's done, we can push those integration grids to Mira, which in a highly parallel fashion just takes the integration grids and generates events individually on each rank. And I'll talk more about that part in the next step. And then after that, we have a data transfer over grid FTP back to the HEK cluster, so that the last step, the particle showering, gets run again on that HEK cluster, and then the results are transferred back to Atlas. The way that this is happening now is that the job descriptions that come in are, I described the production system before, the job descriptions that we get in are independent of the production system. We're getting them out of band because we're not exactly integrated with the production system yet. And the data that's transferred back is transferred back manually, but it could be automated. So this is what I described before. The input to the job from the cluster to Mira is actually very small. And the way that we started out with this, we had file per rank output from Mira going back to the cluster, which was really not a good solution for us. So over time, we iterated on this to arrive at a workflow that looks more like this, where we're still doing the integration on the HEK cluster, but the Mira job consists of multiple invocations of the application. And this is to the question earlier. In this case, we have to run the application 2 times. The first time generates events, and the second one does a data reduction on it based on the probabilities established by the events that were generated in the first step. In a trivial case, this would look like we ran the first job, we wrote all of its data out to the file system, and then the second instance of the application would run and read all of the data back in from the file system. In this case, we stored all of the intermediate results in persistent memory on Mira. So each compute node has persistent memory, which is IBM's word for a RAM disk, so that we saved all of that time writing out data to the file system and reading it back in. And then we collected it from persistent memory using collective I/O and wrote it out to a single file, which was then pushed to the HEK cluster for later post-processing. We have other options for optimizing this. I made this, there's very little information in this slide, but I wanted to point out that what we did to bring this job in and manage the workflow across the HEK cluster and Mira and back to the HEK cluster is part of the larger workflow that would take place in the production system. We're hoping to get there where those things will be integrated, but we're not there yet. This slide talks about use of the persistent memory, the RAM disk, on the Mira compute nodes. I won't go through this in the interest of time, but there's a reference there to the IBM Red books, which will give you more details about persistent memory if you're interested. For the HEK work, through the workflow that we built to run jobs on Mira, we pushed 70 million hours through that workflow last year. We've generated events at rates that were not possible previously. The largest jobs requested over 1 trillion events. The scales of jobs that we're able to run previously would finish after running for a whole day on a single node. And for rare events, they would have produced no events because they're that rare. On Mira, we're able to actually produce these events because of the sheer scale. For this type of event generation, Mira is the primary site doing this now. And events that would have taken years to produce have been generated within a couple of months. The summary slide, you will encounter workflows. I wish, like I said, that I had been able to tell you how to solve your problems. What I will tell you is, in very practical terms, you will likely code these using some combination of scripting in Bash and Python and using some workflow systems. Workflows are still it's being pursued very actively, and so we will see more progress in this area, especially as the problem gets compounded by moving to larger scale systems and more complex codes and coupled simulations, for example. While you're operating in these two domains, or if you're operating in the Bash and Python approach, it's very easy for you to end up essentially building your own workflow system. I caution you against that. And I'd also say that, similar to workflows, data curation has a similar problem. So it's very easy for you to end up in the same place, and you have to be careful to make sure that you manage your data in a way so that you can find it in N years when you need it. And hopefully, you won't for too long be just on your own to manage things. But we always encounter smart people at PESC, so I'm confident that you'll all manage things and solve your problems in a great way.
So when you're stating in the end that the same should apply to the data workflow, just out of curiosity, how often are actually these pieces of data asked for, or do most of the data items which are stored in the libraries never touched again?
So are you referring to one of the particular cases, either HEK or the high energy physics example, or?
Kind of. That's more globally. Do you have an idea of how many of the data items which are stored in the libraries will be touched at some later point again?
So that's a hard question. I would say for the high energy physics example, that production system for moving data from step 1 to step N and publishing on it has been in existence for a long time, and the resulting analyses have already appeared in publications. So Tom Lecomte, for example, who I referred to, would say in the last years of simulation has resulted in, I believe it's 25 publications, if that's a metric that tells you how often the data is referred to. I'd like to think that the compression in the pipeline that we achieved by using Mira of 2 years of jobs into a few months accelerates that, so we'll see much more access of that data. In terms of HEK, I can only say that the reliance on, say, Galaxy catalogs in the past in this field, I mean, they appear prominently in publications over the years, and I expect that these same catalogs that are being produced by the HEK simulations will have a similar effect. And that's the goal of PDAX is to make that possible. How often they've been accessed, it would be a hard question in that field to answer historically about catalogs. And we don't have the data yet for these catalogs because honestly we're still in the process of generating them. But by making the analysis possible this way, not only do we make it easier for users because we don't have to give the data to them, they don't have to manage the storage and compute for looking at the data, they don't have to write the analysis codes, but we also have essentially an archive of the analyses that were done, and in the future we'll be able to answer questions like that very precisely.